You think they're pulling away because you're not enough. But what if your need to be chosen is exactly what's pushing them further away? There is a single shift, quiet, almost invisible, that doesn't force love, but removes the pressure that suffocates it. And when that pressure disappears, something strange happens. They start to notice the space you stopped filling for them. Look closely at human connection, not as romance, but as psychology. Some people don't move toward closeness when they feel love. They move away when they feel consumed by it. So when you chase, explain, overgive, overtext, overprove, you are not creating intimacy. You are creating emotional weight, and weight does not attract. It pushes. But when you stay present without pursuit, when you stop trying to pull closeness out of someone who is stepping back, something unexpected happens. They start to feel the absence of your overextension. And in that absence, curiosity is born. Not because you played a game, but because you stopped abandoning yourself to hold on to them. Avoidant attachment is not simply emotional coldness or a lack of interest in closeness. It is usually a learned survival strategy built over time. At its core, it forms when emotional needs were not consistently met in early relationships, often in environments where vulnerability was ignored, minimized, or even punished. The mind adapts by concluding that dependence on others is unsafe, so it creates distance as a form of self-protection. What looks like detachment in adulthood is often a deeply conditioned reflex to avoid emotional overwhelm or potential rejection. When intimacy increases, an avoidant system can interpret it as pressure or loss of autonomy rather than comfort. This does not mean they do not feel attachment. Rather, the feeling of attachment activates internal alarm signals. The nervous system associates closeness with the risk of being engulfed, controlled, or disappointed, so it automatically initiates withdrawal to restore a sense of control. This is why avoidant individuals can seem warm and engaged at a distance, but become inconsistent or emotionally unavailable when things deepen. Underneath this pattern is often a split between desire and fear. There is a genuine longing for connection, but it is suppressed the moment it feels too intense or demanding. So they regulate emotional discomfort not by communicating needs, but by reducing proximity. This creates the paradox where the more someone pursues them emotionally, the more unsafe they feel, and the more they pull away, not because the connection is unwanted, but because it feels destabilizing. Understanding this shifts the perspective completely. The behavior is not random rejection, but a protective loop trying to maintain emotional equilibrium. When someone with avoidant tendencies is pursued intensely, their internal experience is often very different from what the pursuer intends. The person chasing is usually operating from anxiety, fear of loss, and a need for reassurance, which translates into more texting, more explaining, more emotional expression, and a stronger push for clarity or commitment. On the surface, this looks like love or dedication, but energetically and psychologically, it often feels like pressure to the other person. For an avoidant system, that pressure is not interpreted as intimacy, it is interpreted as demand. Instead of creating closeness, excessive pursuit activates a self-protective mechanism. The nervous system begins to associate the relationship with obligation rather than choice. What was once a space of curiosity or mild connection can quickly shift into a feeling of being emotionally cornered. The avoidant person does not consciously decide to withdraw in a calculated way. The withdrawal is more automatic, like stepping back from heat that feels overwhelming. The more the pursuer advances emotionally, the more the avoidant retreats to restore internal balance. This dynamic also creates an unconscious power imbalance. The pursuer starts to overinvest, often sacrificing their own emotional stability to maintain connection, while the avoidant starts to feel responsible for managing the intensity coming toward them. That responsibility can feel heavy. even if the intentions are loving. Over time, this imbalance reduces attraction because attraction requires a sense of freedom and emotional breathing space. Ironically, pursuit removes the very conditions under which genuine closeness can develop. Real connection requires mutual movement, not one-sided chasing. When one person constantly fills every gap, there is no space left for the other person's desire to arise naturally. In that emptiness created by stepping back, curiosity can return, because the relationship is no longer experienced as pressure, but as possibility. Pursuit energy is not about love itself, but about the emotional state behind the behavior. It often comes from anxiety, insecurity, and the fear of being left, which creates a subtle but powerful urgency in how someone communicates and behaves. This urgency can show up as frequent checking in, over-explaining feelings, seeking immediate responses, or trying to resolve emotional uncertainty right away. While the intention is usually connection, the underlying signal being transmitted is instability rather than calm assurance. To the nervous system of another person, especially someone with avoidant tendencies, this kind of energy is not processed as romantic interest. It is processed as emotional pressure. Humans are highly sensitive to the emotional states of others, even when nothing explicit is said. So when someone approaches with high need, high intensity, and low internal grounding, it creates a sense that the relationship requires constant management. Instead of feeling invited into closeness, the avoidant individual feels pulled into responsibility for someone else's emotional regulation. True attraction is deeply tied to perceived emotional stability, not perfection, not detachment, but steadiness. When a person appears internally anchored, their presence feels safe because it does not demand immediate reassurance or reaction. In contrast, pursuit energy often carries an unspoken message of, "I need you to fix how I feel." That shifts the dynamic from connection to emotional dependency. This is why pursuit rarely produces the outcome it intends. The more urgency is expressed, the more the other person senses a loss of space, and space is essential for desire to form naturally. Desire requires room for absence, curiosity, and self-directed movement. When everything is saturated with emotional intensity, there is no psychological distance for longing to develop. In essence, pursuit energy collapses attraction by replacing mystery with demand, and replacing emotional freedom with subtle obligation, which the nervous system instinctively resists rather than embraces. Secure presence is not about being emotionally distant or pretending not to care. It is about being internally regulated enough that your emotions do not spill outward as pressure onto another person. It is a state where attention, affection, and interest exist without urgency, where connection is offered but not forced. In relational dynamics, especially with someone who tends to withdraw under emotional intensity, this kind of presence becomes profoundly stabilizing because it does not trigger the instinct to escape. When someone is grounded in secure presence, they do not interpret silence as rejection or distance as abandonment. Instead, they maintain continuity within themselves. This means their sense of worth is not constantly being negotiated through another person's responses. Because of that, their behavior changes naturally. They do not over-text to reduce anxiety, they do not over-explain to secure certainty, and they do not escalate emotional intensity to keep connection alive. Their emotional world is not dependent on immediate external validation. From the perspective of someone who is avoidant, this energy feels noticeably different. There is no emotional demand embedded in the interaction. The absence of pressure creates a sense of space, and space is something the avoidant system can tolerate, even relax into. When there is no constant push for reassurance or closeness, the nervous system does not need to activate defense mechanisms. Instead of feeling pursued, they feel free to approach at their own pace. This freedom is important because attraction in such dynamics is closely linked to autonomy. When a person feels they can move towards someone without being pulled or trapped, their natural curiosity is more likely to surface. Secure presence allows that process to unfold without interference. It does not rush emotional timing, and it does not try to collapse uncertainty prematurely. There is also an internal dimension to this. Secure presence communicates self-respect without needing to announce it. It signals that connection is desired, but not at the cost of self-abandonment. This subtle message changes the relational field. Instead of one person chasing and the other retreating, the interaction becomes balanced by choice rather than fear. Over time, this steadiness can become more compelling than intensity, because intensity often burns out or overwhelms, while stability invites trust. Trust, in this context, is not built through persuasion, but through consistency of emotional tone, where nothing in the interaction feels like it is collapsing or demanding immediate repair. If this idea is hitting something deeper in you, pause for a second and reflect. Are you loving them, or chasing the feeling of being chosen? And if you want the second part of this, where the real shift happens in your energy and boundaries, stay with this, because it only gets clearer from here. When emotional distance appears, especially in relationships where one person tends to withdraw, the mind does not experience a simple absence. It experiences uncertainty, and uncertainty activates a deeper psychological process called projection. Projection is when the mind fills gaps in information with internal material, meaning fears, desires, memories, and unresolved emotions get placed onto the other person. So instead of seeing the person clearly, the mind begins to construct a story about them. In the case of emotional distance, curiosity often arises not because clarity is present, but because clarity is missing. The absence of constant emotional input forces the mind to search for meaning. For someone who is more avoidant, distance can create a subtle reduction in pressure, which allows their attention to reset. Without the intensity of pursuit, they are no longer reacting defensively, and this reduction in emotional noise can open space for reflection. Projection works both ways. The person who is distant may also begin to assign meaning to the absence of pursuit. If they are used to being chased, sudden calmness can feel unfamiliar. The mind starts asking why the dynamic has changed. That question is the beginning of curiosity. It is not necessarily conscious or verbalized, but it manifests as increased attention, memory recall, or re-engagement. However, this process is often misunderstood as a tactic. In reality, it is a natural psychological response to space and ambiguity. The key factor is not manipulation, but emotional regulation. When one person stops overwhelming the field with urgency, the other person is no longer reacting to pressure and instead begins to encounter their own internal narrative about the connection. This is where curiosity deepens. Not because the person has changed in a dramatic way, but because the emotional environment has changed. The mind is drawn toward what is not fully defined, and distance creates that undefined space where interpretation, reflection, and reconsideration naturally emerge. True connection begins at the point where self-abandonment ends, because any bond built on losing yourself is already structurally unstable. When a person consistently overrides their own emotional needs, intuition, or boundaries in order to keep someone close, the relationship stops being an interaction between two whole individuals. It becomes an arrangement where one person is continuously adjusting themselves to maintain access to the other. Over time, this creates internal fragmentation, where the self is split between what is genuinely felt and what is performed for the sake of attachment. This pattern is often mistaken for love, but it is actually a form of self-erasure in service of belonging. The nervous system learns to prioritize the presence of the other person over internal coherence. That means discomfort, confusion, or emotional neglect can be tolerated as long as the connection remains intact. But this comes at a cost. Attraction, respect, and emotional safety all begin to erode when one person is no longer fully present in themselves. Real connection requires two grounded centers interacting, not one center orbiting another. When self-abandonment stops, something important shifts. The individual is no longer negotiating their worth through proximity. They are no longer adjusting their emotional expression to prevent loss. Instead, they begin to relate from a place of internal alignment, where their feelings, boundaries, and actions are consistent rather than strategically modified. This consistency changes how they are perceived. Not because they are trying to be seen differently, but because they are no longer distorting themselves to maintain attachment. Paradoxically, this creates more relational clarity. The other person is no longer interacting with a version shaped by fear or overextension, but with someone who is emotionally intact. In such a state, connection becomes a choice rather than a dependency, and when connection is chosen rather than clung to, it carries a different quality. It is lighter, more honest, and less burdened by hidden negotiation. That is where genuine emotional depth becomes possible, because neither person is losing themselves to keep the bond alive. Silence and space are often misunderstood as absence, but psychologically they are active conditions that reveal the structure of a relationship with surprising clarity. When emotional noise, constant messaging, or pursuit is reduced, what remains is not emptiness, but truth. The mind of the other person is no longer being continuously shaped by external emotional input, so their internal state begins to surface without interference. This is where real dynamics become visible. For someone who tends to withdraw under pressure, silence can initially feel like relief. The nervous system is no longer under demand, no longer reacting, no longer preparing for emotional expectation. In that relief, defenses soften. When there is no need to manage someone else's urgency, internal space opens. In that space, thoughts that were previously pushed aside can begin to emerge naturally. This includes reflection on the connection itself, curiosity about the change, and subtle awareness of what is now missing. At the same time, silence also removes distraction for the person who previously pursued. Without constant engagement, they are confronted with their own emotional state rather than the reaction of the other person. This is where clarity often begins, because what was previously expressed outwardly now turns inward. The absence of response creates a mirror effect, where intentions, attachments, and insecurities become more visible. Space does not create emotion, but it exposes what was already there but masked by interaction. If there is genuine connection, it becomes more apparent in silence because it persists without stimulation. If there is dependence or imbalance, it also becomes clearer because it struggles in the absence of constant reinforcement. This is why silence can feel uncomfortable yet revealing. It strips away performance, urgency, and reaction, leaving behind only what is structurally real in the bond. In that revealed state, both individuals are forced into awareness of whether the connection exists through presence or only through constant emotional maintenance. The idea that the goal is to become internally unshakable instead of trying to make someone stay shifts the entire foundation of how relationships are approached. Most emotional pursuit is built on fear of loss, and that fear quietly drives behaviors like over-explaining, over-giving, or constantly adjusting oneself to prevent distance. But those behaviors do not create stability. They create dependency on outcome. Internally unshakable presence is the opposite state, where your emotional center is not reorganized every time someone moves closer or further away. To become internally steady means your sense of worth is not being negotiated in real time through someone else's attention. You can still feel desire, attachment, or disappointment, but those emotions do not dictate your actions in a compulsive way. There is a gap between feeling and reaction. In that gap, choice exists. And where there is choice, there is no emotional collapse. In relational dynamics, this changes everything. When you are no longer trying to prevent abandonment, your energy stops communicating urgency. That urgency is often what creates pressure in the interaction, even when it is disguised as love or care. Without it, the emotional field becomes lighter. The other person is no longer interacting with someone who is trying to secure them at all costs. Instead, they encounter someone who is present but not gripping. This does not guarantee that anyone will stay or return, and that is an important correction. Internal strength is not a strategy to control outcomes. It is the removal of desperation from your participation. When desperation is gone, your perception becomes clearer. You are no longer interpreting every silence as danger or every delay as rejection. You see behavior more accurately because you are not emotionally entangled in survival reactions. Over time, this steadiness also changes what you are available for. You stop investing deeply where there is only inconsistency. You stop confusing intensity with intimacy. You begin to value reciprocity over potential. This naturally filters relationships, not through force, but through clarity. What remains is not emotional detachment, but emotional sovereignty. You can still care, but you are no longer pulled into self-abandonment to maintain connection. And in that state, whatever connection exists either becomes real and mutual, or it fades without you needing to chase it into distortion. Everything comes back to a simple but uncomfortable truth. You cannot force emotional closeness into existence without distorting yourself in the process. The more you chase, over-explain, or try to secure someone's attention, the more you often activate the very distance you are trying to prevent. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because intensity without inner stability is felt as pressure, not connection. What actually changes the dynamic is not strategy, but state. When you stop abandoning yourself to keep someone close, your presence changes. When you are no longer emotionally dependent on immediate responses, you stop transmitting urgency. And when urgency disappears, the interaction is no longer driven by fear or pursuit, but by choice. That shift alone is enough to completely alter how you are experienced in a relationship. If someone is meant to meet you in mutual presence, they will respond to that steadiness with clarity rather than confusion. If they are not able to meet you there, their distance becomes information instead of something to fix. Either way, you are no longer trapped in guessing, chasing, or collapsing your own emotional world just to maintain access to someone else. The real transformation is internal. You stop measuring your value by how strongly someone reacts to you. You stop interpreting silence as rejection or distance as failure. You begin to see that connection cannot survive where self-abandonment is required to maintain it. In the end, the most powerful shift is not making someone chase you. It is reaching a point where you no longer chase what requires you to lose yourself. From that place, relationships either become mutual or they naturally fall away without breaking you in the process.